Hey everyone, what's up? Welcome back to Babel on Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Zayin, Daf 7 of Masechta Ayruvin. It's hard for me to tell about. Daf's a cool daf. What do you want me to tell you? It's like not so long. It's hard to tell. I'm not even being clear over here, so let's just get to the overview. We're going to start off continuing with our question from yesterday about how could the people of Narda gone double lehumra, gone lehumra like Rav and also like Shmuel. We'll get to it. I'll reintroduce it in a second. And then we get into this interesting sugya, which, you see, here's the thing about this second sugya. It's complicated when you don't understand it. When you understand it, it's not complicated. At least that was my experience. So hopefully, since it's not complicated for me anymore, I'll be able to share it with you in a way that isn't complicated for you either. And that's what I was kind of saying, what I don't know about this daf is, on the one hand, it was pretty complicated for me. On the other hand, now that I get it, it's not that complicated and it's also not that long. So I can't really tell if it's if this episode, let's say, is going to be complicated or not. So anyways, and that sugya is a mavui that opens, basically, you have a mavui that opens up into some other space that then opens up into Rosh Hashanah. Can you carry in that mavui? Yeah, I know. Sounds really exciting. Okay, let's go weiter. So we're on Daf Zayin Amud Aleph. Where? Who could tell me where? Well, I know what I'm looking for. Here it is. Makom Makom Kasha. It's about 2, 4, 6, 8 lines into the page. Okay, so what were we talking about? Yesterday, we at the end we discussed this incident in Neharda, and what happened in Neharda was that there was a chet-shaped mavui, which means that you're on Main Street and you turn into the mavui on Main Street and you're going northwards in the mavui, and then you get to the corner, to the end. You turn left, now you're going westwards through the mavui. You get to the end of that. You now make another left, and now you're going southbound in Mavui number Chet, and you end back on Main Street. So, this Chet-shaped Mavui, okay, so they did like the chumras of Rav and the chumras of Shmuel. They did like the chumra of Rav to say that these Mavuis are treated like Mavui mefulashes, and therefore you cannot get away with simply putting a lechi at the entrance of each of the 2 mavuis where they hit Rosh Hashanah, meaning where this chet-shaped mavui, where they hit Rosh Hashanah, you can't simply put a lechi over there and then assume that you'll be able to carry it in the mavui. And chumra number 2, they did like Shmuel to say that the way to make a mavui a mefulash kosher is that, so on where it hits, so on one end you would put a lechi or a korah, but on the other hand, it would not be enough to simply put a tzuras pesach. You would have to actually put a door over there. So that's what they did in this mavui. At the ends of each of the 2 north-south mavuis, they put a door and not just a tzuras pesach. So they did like the chumra of Rav to assume that this chet-shaped mavui akum is what it was called, is considered a mavui mefulash, and therefore you would have to do the more complicated way of enabling you to carry there, which means that you can't simply get away with a lechi or a korah. You also have to have something on the other end. And then they did like the chumra of Shmuel to say that what they put at the other end was not simply a tzuras pesach, but rather a door. And what we want to answer, the question that we have is, how could they have done double chumras? How could they have done like the chumra of Rav and the chumra of Shmuel? Because after all, we have this brisa which was saying, look, if you want, you can either choose to do like Beis Hillel Adasof, or like Beis Shammai Adasof, which means the kulas and the chumras, but don't just pick the kulas of Beis Shammai and the kulas of Beis Hillel. Don't just pick the chumras of Beis Shammai and the chumras of Beis Hillel. Pick a side and stick with it. If you want to pick Beis Hillel, always do like Beis Hillel. Chumras, kulas, everything. If you want to do like Beis Shammai, chumras, kulas, everything. Don't just pick the kulas, but even don't just pick the chumras either. So how come now swap Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel for Rav and Shmuel, right? If you want to do like Rav, hold like Rav. If you want to say that this Mavui Akum we're going to treat like a Mavui Mefulash, well then kasher it like a Mavui Mefulash and say all you need is a Tzuras of Pesach. If you want to do like Shmuel, well then it's not a Mavui Mefulash Bichlal, it's a Mavui Sasam and all you need is a Lechi. So what's Pshat, friends? What's Pshat? So says the Gemara, Mikol Makom Kasha. So we have this question of how could the people of Narda do like the chumras of both Rav and Shmuel. So Amar of Nachman bar Yitzchak Kulei Kirav Avdua. So Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak says, well, they actually weren't doing the chumras of Rav and the chumras of Shmuel. Rather, they were just passing like Rav. And Rav actually would have said the same thing, that they should put a doorway at the end of the Mavui Mefulash. So they were doing like Rav to say that we're going to treat this Mavui Akum as a Mavui Mefulash. And they were also doing like Rav to say that a door goes at the end. But didn't Rav say like the Tanakama yesterday in the machlokas between the Tanakama and Hananya, right? The Tanakama said that by a Mavui Mefulash, all you need to do is put a Tzuras Pesach on one end and a Lechi or Korah on the other end, whereas Hananya quoted the machlokas between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, and of course we passing like Beis Hillel, who say that you have to put a doorway at one end of the Mavui Mefulash and a Lechi or a Korah at the other end. So didn't Rav, we said yesterday that Rav paskins like the Tanakama about the Tzuras of Pesach, and Shmuel paskins like Hananya / Beis Hillel, who say you would have to put a door there. So what Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak wants to argue is that Rav would actually also say that by Mavui Mefulash you should put a door over there, and not just a Tzuras Pesach. But didn't he pass like the Tanakama who says all you need is a Tzuras Pesach? The Amar Rav Huna Amar Rav Halacha Vein Morin Ken. Says Rav Huna in the name of Rav that when Rav says that the halacha is like the Tanakama, that by Mavui Mefulash all you need to do is a Tzuras Pesach on one end and then a Lechi or a Korah on the other end, it's technically speaking the halacha. Me'ikar adin, it's the halacha. If you did it, if you put a Tzuras Pesach at one end, that's fine. That's absolutely fine. However, if you're going to come to us and you're going to say, hey, I have a Mavui Mefulash, I want to carry in it, what do? We would tell you to put a door over there. And therefore, the people of Narda, they were actually doing like Rav, because even Rav would advise to put a door there. Just that he says, Me'ikar adin, if you put a Tzuras Pesach, it would work. So therefore, the people of Narda were actually doing entirely like Rav. So again, Amar of Nachman bar Yitzchak Kulei Kirav Avdua, in Narda they were doing entirely like Rav. The Amar of Huna Amar Rav Halacha Vein Morin Ken. That says Rav Huna in the name of Rav that while the halacha is like the Tanakama, that by Mavui Mefulash all you need is a Tzuras Pesach, however, we do not instruct people to do that way. Rather, what we instruct people to do is like Beis Hillel, which is to put a door. Rav Ada bar Ahava Amar Rav. But what about according to Rav Ada bar Ahava, who says in the name of Rav, the Amar Halacha Umorin Ken? Rav Ada bar Ahava says in the name of Rav that actually the halacha is like the Tanakama, that all you need is a Tzuras Pesach, and this is what we do advise people to do. If you come to us and say, hey, I got a Mavui Mefulash that I want to carry, and we would say, okay, great, build a Tzuras Pesach on one end, and a Lechi and a Korah on the other. So Michael Meimar, well, if that's the case, well then, how come the people in Narda put a door there? If they're passing like Rav, the Chumrah, to say that it's a Mavui Mefulash, well then, also passing like Rav Lekula to say that all you need is a Tzuras Pesach, why did they put a door over there? Amr of Shezvi, Kilo Avdinon Kichumre Deve Trey, Heicha Desasri Adade. So it says of Shezvi something very interesting. That when we say, don't be machmir, like both opinions, that's only when, by doing so, that by being machmir, like both opinions, you are going to contradict your own principles. Meaning, if the opinion of one of them is based on a principle that in one context would be a chumrah, yet in another context would actually, that same principle would then end up being a kula, well then don't paskin like the other opinion, which would undermine the principle. Let's go weiter for a second and explain what that means. So, Kigon, for example, Shedra v'Gugolis, a spine and a skull. Okay, so we know, we actually learned the other day right? When we were talking about the different shiurim, we said that what's the shiur that we learn out from barley? That an etzem kiseora is mitami b'mago uv'masa, but not be'ohel. That a bone that does not have any meat on it, a bone from a mace, right? If there was, right, kazayis basar min mace, if you have a kazayis of meat, of flesh from a corpse, that will be mitami be'ohel. However, if you have a bone, and that bone does not have any meat on it, well then, once it's the size of a kernel of barley, well then it will be mitame if you touch it or if you carry it. However, it will not transfer tumas ohel. However, if you have, let's say, a complete spine, or if you have a skull, even though it's just bone, it will be mitame ba'ohel. Okay, so let's say you have a complete spine and it's lying there on the floor of your house. Well, it's going to be mitame ohel. Okay, now, what if you have a full spine minus a vertebrae? I think that's the right word. I meant to look it up. I think vertebrae is just like one of the spiny things, right? Let's just assume that. And if it isn't, then know that when I say vertebrae, I mean one of those spine little component guys. So, where were we? Right. So let's say you have a spine lying there on the floor of your house. So it'll be matami ba'ohel. But what if it's missing a vertebrae? Ditnan, as we learned in the Mishnah, shedra v'agolgoles, if you have a spine or a skull, let's focus on the spine for a second. Shechasru. Actually, well, let's just let the Mishnah talk for itself. So shedra v'agolgoles shechasru. If you have a spine or a skull that are missing some, v'chama chisaron b'shedra. So now, what would be considered lacking when it comes to a spine? Beishamai omim shtei chulios, v'sil omim chulia achas. So Beishamai says that when it comes to a spine, so the spine would only be considered lacking once it's missing 2 vertebrae. Beisil says once it's missing 1 vertebrae, it's already considered lacking. So in this context, Beishamai is being the machmir opinion, Beisil is being the makel opinion, because in this context, if you have a spine lying on the floor of your house, so it's going to be mitami ba'ohel. However, what if it's missing 1 vertebrae? So Beis Hillel says, right, chulia achas is going to be a chisaron. Once it's missing 1 vertebrae, well then, you don't have a full spine anymore. It's a chisaron, it's missing, it's lacking. And if you don't have a full spine anymore, well then, it's just bone. And we say that bone, while it's mitami b'maga umasa, it's not mitami ba'ohel. So therefore, Beis Hillel says that once 1 vertebrae is missing, it's considered lacking, and therefore it's not matami ba'ohel. Beis Shammai says it's going to continue to be matami ba'ohel until it's missing 2 vertebrae. So we see that Beis Shammai is the more machmir opinion here. Uvugulgoles, and similarly when it comes to a skull, how much needs to be missing to be considered lacking? Beis Shammai omrim kimlo mikadeach, ubeis Hillel omrim kidei sheinato menachai v'yamus. Beis Shammai says that if the skull is missing the size that you would drill through with an auger. An auger, I looked it up, is some kind of like drill bit kind of thing. So if you would take this auger and then you would drill through the skull, the amount that's missing from there, so if the skull is missing that much, then it would no longer be mitami be'ohel. Enough from the skull that if you were to remove it from a live fellow, he would no longer be alive. Beseder. And in that case also, Beis Shammai is the more machmir opinion that you would have to remove more of the skull in order for it no longer to be mitami ba'ohel. Now friends, here is the part that makes it interesting for us. V'amar Yehuda amar Shmuel v'chein le'inyan treifa. And says Rav Yehuda amar Shmuel that they maintain, that Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel maintain the same opinion. They maintain their positions when it comes to a treifa. So let's just take the spine for an example, as the example, because it's just more objective, 1 vertebrae versus 2 vertebrae. So we said that when it comes to, let's say you have a spine lying there on the floor of the house and it's missing 1 vertebrae. So Beis Shammai was the more machmir opinion, because they say 1 vertebrae is not enough. 1 vertebrae missing is not enough to consider this spine to be lacking. And therefore it's still going to be mitami ba'ohel. Whereas Beis Hillel says that one vertebrae missing, the spine is already considered lacking, and therefore it won't be matami be'ohel anymore, right? Beis Shammai says it will continue to be matami be'ohel until it's missing two. Beis Hillel says that it's not matami be'ohel once it's missing one. So Beis Shammai is being more machmir, Beis Hillel is being more mekel. Now, friends, if we now what if we now apply the same principle to treifas? What if you have an animal and we're trying to determine if it's treif and it's missing one vertebrae? Well, Beis Shammai seems to say that that's not significant. And if it's not significant, if one vertebrae missing is not significant, well then this animal is not a treifa. It's fine. You can eat it. No problem. They're now being mekel. Beis Hillel would say one vertebrae missing is significant, and therefore this animal is a treifa. You can't eat it. So Beis Shammai's principle, which is that one vertebrae missing is not significant enough, while it's a chumra when it comes to tumas ha'ohel, in that this spine is going to continue to contaminate your house. However, it becomes a kula in the context of treifa, because you can eat this animal. It's no big deal that it's missing one vertebrae. Whereas Beis Hillel's opinion, which is that one vertebrae is significant, so while it's a kula when it comes to tumas ha'ohel, because once it's missing one vertebrae, the spine will no longer contaminate the house. However, it becomes a chumra in the context of treifas, because once it's missing one vertebrae, then that's already going to make it treif and you cannot eat it. So we see that, this principle of the significance of one vertebrae can create a kula or a chumra in one context and the exact opposite in the other. Now, if you're going to go in both cases lehumra, so if you're going to say that if you have a vertebrae that's missing, if you have a spine that's missing one vertebrae, and in a house you say that it's going to be matami the house because one vertebrae, that means that you're basically saying that one vertebrae missing is not a big deal, and this is still a spine, and it's matami ba'oel. If you're then going to then say that when it comes to treifa, if it's missing one vertebrae, it's treif and you can't eat it, well then you're saying that one vertebrae is significant, and it's going to make this thing treif. So, what is it? What do you hold? Do you say that one vertebrae is insignificant, or do you say that one vertebrae is significant? Be consistent. So, Rav Shezvi wants to say that when we say that you cannot apply the chumras of both opinions, that's only when it basically is gonna, when we're saying make up your mind, when it's going to contradict a principle that you are apparently holding by, right? And therefore, if in the case of, let's say that tuma, you say that a vertebrae is significant, well then say the same thing by treifa and vice versa. However, in this case, by saying that this mavui akum is considered a mavui mefulash, right? Basically what you're saying is that area where it connects to the other part of the mavui is more than daled tfachim. And daled tfachim basically creates a mavui mefulash. You're not going to undermine that by then saying put a door at the end rather than in Tzuras HaPesach. And therefore, if you want to be machmir, both cases, be machmir. Right? You're not being contradictory by adapting both chumras. Only in a case where by adapting both chumras, you're actually going to be contradictory, and we're going to say, make up your mind, brother, well then, don't do like both chumras. But as long as the two chumras don't contradict each other, they're just two chumras, so be machmir as much as you want. What do we care? Have a good time. But one second. Just because they contradict each other in principle, you can't adapt two chumras that contradict each other in principle? Maser of Mesharsha. Mesharsha asked the kasha. Ma'aseh Rebbe Akiva. There was a story with Rebbe Akiva. Shaliket esrog be'echad b'shvat. That he harvested esrogim on the first day of Shvat. Now, there's a machlokas between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel about when the new year for fruits are. Beis Shammai say that the new year for fruit is the 1st of Shvat, and Beis Hillel say that the new year for fruit is on the 15th of Shvat, on Tu B'Shvat. So now, Rabbi Akiva, he harvested his esrogim on the first day of Shvat, V'noag bo beis isurin, echad k'divrei Beis Shammai v'echad k'divrei Beis Hillel. And he took two meisers, one like Beis Shammai, one like Beis Hillel. Now, basically this year that we're talking about with Rabbi Akiva, that year was Rosh Hashanah for the trees was going to make it year 3 of Shemitah, right? Meaning that it was the end of the second year of the Shemitah cycle and the beginning of the third year of the Shemitah cycle. Now, this was the first day of Shvat, which means that if you hold like Beis Shammai, that the first day of Shvat is Rosh Hashanah for trees, well then that means that you have to treat it like the new year, like year 3. Now, in year 3, you take Meiser Ani, which is 10% that you give to poor people. Now, if you hold like Beis Hillel, well then the new year isn't until the 15th of Shvat, which means that it's still year 2, which means that you take Meiser Sheni, which is you take 10% and bring it to Yerushalayim. Now, Rabbi Akiva did like both of them. He did like the chumras of Beis Shammai and the chumras of Beis Hillel. He did like the chumrah of, right, and he separated Meiser Sheni and Meiser Ani. Now, that's contradictory, because if he's taking Meiser Sheni, he's basically saying that he holds like Beis Hillel, that it's still year number 2. But then when he takes Meiser Ani, he's basically saying that he holds like Beis Shammai, that it's year number 3. Well, is it year number 2 or is it year number 3? That's clearly contradictory. It can't be both year number 2 and year number 3. And Rabbi Akiva seems to do it. So apparently there isn't an issue of going lehumra like Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, even when it means that you're contradicting yourself. So the Gemara answers, actually Rabbi Akiva was not contradicting himself. Rabbi Akiva Gamre, Gemara istapik le, V'lo I Beis Hillel b'chad b'shvat amur, I b'chamesa b'shvat amur, v'avaracha l'chumra v'achad l'chumra. No, rather, Rabbi Akiva was not contradicting himself. He just wasn't, he was passing like Beis Hillel. He was not passing like Beis Shammai. He was passing like Beis Hillel. But he forgot what Beis Hillel's opinion was. He forgot, oy vey, did Beis Hillel say that the first day of Shvat was Rosh Hashanah, or is the 15th of Shvat Rosh Hashanah, the Ilanus? And because he didn't know, so therefore he had no choice but to go lechumra in both cases, because just in case it was the new year, he wanted to take Meiser Ani, and in case it was the second year, he needed to take Meiser Sheni. So therefore, out of chumra, because he just didn't know, so he had to be machmir. However, we would still Rav Shezvi would maintain his principle that in a case where by doing like 2 chumras of 2 different opinions, you would be contradicting yourself, such as saying it's the second year and the third year. You can't do that. You're gonna have to make up your mind. And therefore, in the case of this Mavui Akum, they were able to pass like Rav and like Shmuel by both of their chumras without contradicting any underlying principles. Okay, continues the Gemara. Yosef Rav Yosef kamed Rav Huna. Oh, so Rav Yosef was sitting in front of Rav Huna. Nice. Rav Yosef ka'amar, and he said the following. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav. Okay, so Yosef quoted Rav Yehuda in the name of Rav. Machlokas b'srate mikan, v'srate mikan, uflate mikan, uflate mikan. So it says Rav Yosef that this machlokas between the Tanakama and Chananya, do you need a tzuras pesach plus a lechi or korah, or do you need a door plus a lechi or korah? So this machlokas is only by when you have on either side of the Mavui Mefulash, you have either a public thoroughfare or a public square. I.e., there's a Rishus HaRabim on either end, on either side of this Mavui Mefulash. So then there's a machlokas between the Tanakama and Chananya about, do you need is it Tzuras HaPesach? Do you need a Tzuras HaPesach, or do you need a door? Aval Srata mikan uvika mikan. But if you have on one side of the Mavui Mefulash is a Rishus HaRabim, but on the other side of the Mavui Mefulash is a what's that thing called when it's not a Rishus HaRabim and not Rishus HaYachid? Carmelis. So if on the other side of the Mavui Mefulash it's a Carmelis, ubika mikan uvika mikan, or if on both sides of the Mavui Mefulash were a Carmelis, well then, also Tzuras HaPesach mikan v'lechi v'korah mikan. Well then, everyone agrees that, like the Tanakama, that all you need would be a Tzuras HaPesach on one end and a lechi v'korah on the other end, and that, meaning lechi or korah on the other end, and that would be enough. Okay, so the machlokas is only when there's a Rishus HaRabim on both sides. But if there's a Rishus HaRabim on only one side, or if both sides are a Carmelis, well then you would only need a Tzuras HaPesach. Everyone agrees. Now the Gemara asks, Hashta strata mikan uvika mikan osilo tzuras pesach mikan v'lechi v'kor mikan. Well, if we already said that when one side of the Mavui Mefulash is a Rishus HaRabim and the other side of the Mavui Mefulash is a Carmelis, all you need to do is a tzuras pesach on one end and a lechi or korah on the other end. Well then, bika mikan uvika mikan, if on both sides of the Mavui Mefulash were a Carmelis, well then, mibaya, do you even need to ask? Obviously not. If when one side is a Rishus HaRabim and the other side is a Carmelis, we say everyone agrees that all you need is a tzuras pesach, well then obviously when both sides of the Mavui Mefulash are a Carmelis, all you would need is a tzuras pesach. So the Gemara answers, Hachi ka'amar, this is what Rav Yehuda is saying in the name of Rav. Srata mikan uvika mikan, naisa kevika mikan uvika mikan. That when you have a Rishus HaRabim on one side of the Mavui Mefulash and a Carmelis on the other side of the Mavui Mefulash, it's ki'ilu you have a Carmelis on both sides of the Mavui Mefulash, and all you would need is a tzuras pesach. Okay, not so bad. Friends, I need you to pay attention now. Now, remember, Rav Yosef was in front of Rav Huna, and he was talking and learning, and the final thing that he said was something in the name of Rav Yehuda. While Rav Yosef, up until now, was quoting Rav Yehuda in the name of Rav, this conclusion, this sort of final thing that he said, he quoted in the name of Rav Yehuda, but he didn't say if Rav Yehuda was saying it in the name of Rav or not. So, Mesayim b'mishmed Rav Yehuda, Rav Yosef then concluded his words in the name of Rav Yehuda, Im haya Mavui kale l'rachava eino tzarich klum. If you have a Mavui that hits like a rechava, then you don't need to do anything other than a lechi and a korah. What does this mean? Look at the diagram on page 7A3. There is one diagram there at the bottom. Now, you will see in this diagram that you have Rishus HaRabim, Main Street. You have a Mavui. You turn into the Mavui. On either end of the Mavui, you have your Chatzar. So far, regular Mavui. This is where things get different. Now, the Mavui then in the back of it doesn't have a wall. It's not a dead end. And also the other side is not a Rishus HaRabim either. Rather, the Mavui opens up into this rechava, into what the Art Scroll defines here as a back lot. Now, as you will notice in the diagram, there are no houses that open up into this back lot. It's just some kind of a lot, some kind of a backyard that the Mavui opens into. And then you can walk through that back lot to get to the Rishus HaRabim. So it's basically, you can almost imagine it. Now, I actually don't want to say that route because I don't want to say anything that's going to confuse anything. But rather, basically the idea is you can walk from one Rishus HaRabim straight through this area and get to the other Rishus HaRabim on the other end. However, you would be walking through a Mavui, but then you would be walking through this back lot, through this Rechava, to get to the Rishus HaRabim on the other side. Now, if that back lot wasn't there, and you were just walking straight through the Mavui to get to the other Rishus HaRabim, that would obviously be a Mavui Mefulash. But what makes this case unique is that back lot, that you start on one Rishus HaRabim, Main Street, you walk through the Mavui, then you have to walk through this back lot to then exit on the other side to the other Rishus HaRabim. The question is, do we treat this as a Mavui Mefulash, or do we treat it as a Mavui Sasum? So Rav Yehuda said that we can treat it as a Mavui Sasum, as he says, Ein tzarich klum, you don't need anything. It doesn't literally mean you don't need anything. It means that all you need is a lechi or a korah, and that would suffice. You don't need a tzuras pesach or a door or any Mavui Mefulashi kinds of things. So, great. So far, not so bad as long as you looked at the diagram. So, Amr le Abaye le Rav Yosef. Now, Abaye says to Rav Yosef, Had Rav Yehuda de Shmuelhi. So, as I pointed out, Rav Yosef did not quote this statement of Rav Yehuda in the name of anybody. Now, Rav Yehuda's teachers were Rav and Shmuel. So, up until now, he had been quoting Rav Yehuda in the name of, meaning Rav Yosef, I don't know what I just said. Rav Yosef's teacher was Rav Yehuda, Rav Yehuda's teachers were Rav and Shmuel. So, up until now, Rav Yosef was quoting Rav Yehuda as quoting Rav, Then at the very end, he just quotes Rav Yehuda without quoting anybody when he mentions this Mavui, which opens up into the back lot, which opens up into the Rishus Harabim. So Abaye wants to argue that the statement of Rav Yehuda is in the name of Shmuel, not in the name of Rav. How come? The Rav, Kasha Rav ad Rav. Because if the statement was Rav Yehuda in the name of Rav, well then that would contradict a different statement of Rav Yehuda in the name of a different statement of Rav. What's this other statement of Rav? And he says the Kasha Rav ad Rav betarte regarding two things. We'll get to these two things in a minute, but let's focus on one thing for now. The Amar Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba Amar Rav. It says Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba in the name of Rav, and you can add Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba to the list of Talmud Chavers of Rav, of students who were also like colleagues of Rav. We saw the other day Rav Kahana and Rav Asi were colleagues of Rav, and I actually saw in a note in the art school the other day that he quotes a Tosfos in Chulin, right? We mentioned, we had a discussion in WhatsApp the other day with Adam Friedman about is Rav Asi, who's this Talmud Chaver of Rav in Bavel, the same as the Rabbi Asi, who's a student of Rabbi Yochanan in Eretz Yisrael. And apparently there are two different people. There was a Rav who was a Talmud Chaver of, there was a Rav Asi who was a Talmud Chaver of Rav, and there was also a Rabbi Asi who was a student of Rabbi Yochanan. Al Kopanim, the Gemara in Brachas says that Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba was also a Talmud Chaver of Rav. Anyways, so where were we again? So says Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba in the name of Rav, Mavui shenifratz bimlo'o lechatzer, v'nifratz chatzer kenegdo l'rishus harabim, chatzer muteres u'mavui aser. Let's read that again. Mavui shenifratz bimlo'o lechatzer. If you have a mavui, basically it's the same exact case that we just said. It's basically the same exact thing with the back lot, but just swap out the back lot for a chatzer. Now you can see this diagram on 7b1 at the top left, okay? That it's essentially the same thing as the previous case. However, when you walk through from Main Street into the Mavui does not open up into a back lot, rather it opens up into another chatzer. Now obviously what makes it a chatzer is that you have two homes that open into it, and then you can continue walking straight through to the other side to Rishus Harabim, okay? So now, what does the Gemara say? So, Mavui shenifratz bimlo lechatzer. So if you have this Mavui, that you turn into the Mavui from Main Street, you walk through the Mavui, and now you get to a chatzer. V'nifratz chatzer keneged l'Rishus Harabim, and then you can walk through the chatzer to get to the other side to Rishus Harabim. Chatzer muteres, so the people who live in the homes would be allowed to carry in that chatzer, because there's no reason not to. As long as that breach in the wall is less than 10 amos, it's just a Pesach, and they can carry in the chatzer. Umavui also, you're not allowed to carry in that mavui. Ve'amai, why can't you carry into the mavui? Lahavi k'mavui shekale l'rechava. Why should it be any different than the first case of the mavui that opens up into a back lot? Now, so why is this a kasha? The kasha is that Rav Yehuda said that when you have this setup of a mavui that opens up into this back lot, or into any other area for that matter, and then you can continue through that area to another Rishus Harabim. So Rav Yehuda says that we can treat that as a Mavui Sasum. We don't have to treat that as a Mavui Mefulash, and therefore you could just put a Lechi at the entrance to the Mavui from Main Street, and that would be enough. However, Rav seems to be saying that when you have a similar setup, which is when you turn into the Mavui from Main Street, and then you get to the end of the Mavui, and the Mavui opens up into a chatzer, but you can walk straight through the chatzer into a second Rishus Harabim, that would be a problem. Because according to Rav, we would treat that as a Mavui Mefulash. So therefore, we see that obviously Rav is not the author of that statement from Rav Yehuda, who says that when you have a mavui that opens up into a back lot, you can carry in the mavui as long as you put up a lechi, because Rav would say that that would not work. It would be considered a mavui mefulash, since you could walk out the other side to the other Rishus Harabim, and putting up a lechi will not enable you to carry in the mavui. So that is the question. Now, if you're wondering what question number 2 is, don't worry too much about question number 2 for now. Actually, maybe, I don't know. Let's talk about question number 2. Question number 2 is this, that Rav Yehuda says that Rav Yehuda goes out of his way in his statement to say that we're talking about a back lot and not a chatzer, because the Gemara wants to assume that Rav Yehuda's opinion is that if this wasn't a back lot, if instead it was a chatzer, then you would not be allowed to carry in this mavui, because he holds that when you have a chatzer that opens up into basically when you have a mavui that opens up into a chatzer and you didn't do a shitufei mivoos, you didn't basically join together with all the chatzeros to get into that mavui, then you can no longer carry in the mavui, because the mavui is like a rishus arabim, right? Meaning, so assuming that you have a mavui, and let's say on the right side and the left side of the mavui, you have a chatzer on either side. And the chatzeros did, Ayruvin chatzeros did the shitufei mivoos. However, there's also this other chatzer at the back of the mavui, right? Now, that chatzer didn't join into this shitufei mivoos, okay? Well then, because that chatzer didn't join in to the shitufei mivoos, well, you can no longer carry in that mavui, because since this chatzer is still in the back that didn't join in, is still going to be using the mavui, so basically we're concerned that the mavui is going to be treated like a place that everyone's using, and you didn't make a proper shitufei mivoos, so therefore you can't carry in the mavui anymore. So therefore, so the assumption of the Gemara is that what Rav Yehuda is saying is that as long as that area in the back is a rechava, it's a back lot, well then, look, we're not going to treat this mavui as a mavui amefulash, right? We'll treat it as a mavui sasum, and you can walk and you can carry in the mavui as long as there is a lechi. However, if that back lot wasn't a back lot, rather it was a chatzer, well then there will be a different issue, which is that you're not allowed to carry in the mavui since it's connected to a chatzer that you didn't do a shitufei mivoos with. However, Rav seems to be concerned only with the fact that this mavui, since it's open, you can walk right through it to the other side, to the other rishus harabim. This mavui is a mavui mefulash. He doesn't seem to be concerned with the fact that it's a chatzer. That's not his issue. His issue is that it's a mavui mefulash, right? Implying that if, let's say, it wasn't a mavui mefulash, if the back wall was, let's say, closed, well then he would have no problem with carrying in the mavui, even though it's connected to a chatzer. He doesn't have an issue with that. So therefore, there's a kasha between Rav Yehuda and Rav regarding two things. One, the fact that this setup, Rav Yehuda would consider it to be a mavui sasum and not a mavui mefulash. Rav considers it to be a mavui mefulash. Question number 2 is that Rav Yehuda is assuming that if instead of a rechava, it would be a chatzer, well then you would no longer be allowed to carry in the mavui, since this mavui is connected to a chatzer that is not part of the shitufei mivoos, and therefore you wouldn't be able to carry in the chatzer anymore. Whereas Rav doesn't seem to have an issue with that. His issue is just that you can walk straight through from the mavui through to the other side into rishus harabim, so therefore it would be considered a mavui mefulash. Those are the two questions. I hope that was clear. I think that was the part that I was saying that I kind of did the work to clarify it in my head at least. I'm not sure if I did such a good job clarifying it in your heads though. Hopefully I did. Well, so therefore, for those reasons, Bai wants to argue that statement of Rav Yehuda cannot have been in the name of Rav, because of this contradictory statement of Rav regarding the mavui that you walk through a chatzer to the other side, to rishus harabim. Okay, fine. Amar le, Rav Yosef responds to Abaye and he says, alright, cool. I mean, I can get on board with that. Ana lo yadaina, he says, look, I don't know. Uvda hava, there was once a story, Bidor Deraivasa, in a place where shepherds lived. Mavui shekale l'rachba hava, and there was a mavui that opened up into this back lot. V'asa l'kamed Rav Yehuda, and they asked Rav Yehuda about it. V'lo atzurche v'lo midei, and they said, look, as long as you have a lechi or a korah, it's fine. You don't need to do anything else. It's not considered a mavui mefulash. So he says, look, that's all I know. V'kasha mishmei Rav, tav mishmei Shmuel v'lo kasha midi. He says, look, and if it's going to cause trouble to say that Rav Yehuda said in the name of Rav, no problem. Say it in the name of Shmuel. Like, it's really no big deal. Fine. So Rav Yehuda said that in the name of Shmuel. Great. Now, the Gemara is about to argue that you can even say that this statement of Rav Yehuda regarding the Mavui that opens up into the back lot could have even been Rav. Hashta de Amr le Rav Sheshes le Rav Shmuel bar Abba v'Amr le Rav Yosef bar Abba. Now, that which Rav Sheshes said to Rav Shmuel bar Abba, some said the Ma'aseh is Rav Yosef bar Abba, Az bralach kan she'ervu kan shelo ervu d'Rav Adrav nami lo kasha kan she'ervu b'nei chatzer and b'nei Mavui kan shelo ervu. So apparently Rav Sheshes said that when it comes to a Mavui that opens up into a chatzer, that then opens up on the other side to Rishus HaRabim, as long as you made an Eruv in that chatzer, you can carry in the Mavui. Meaning, as long as you made a Shitufei Mivos, as long as they all join together, all the people with the chatzers that open up into the Mavui, they all join together, well, then you will be able to carry in the Mavui. And therefore, we're saying that Rav is not a Kasha on Rav because because we can assume that is what Rav is saying here. Meaning, what Rav is saying, when Rav said that when you have this Mavui that opens up into the Chatzer, you're not allowed to carry in that Mavui, it's not because he considers it to be a Mavui mifulash since you can walk through to the other side. No way. The reason why Rav says that you're not allowed to carry in that Mavui is because the people in the Chatzer never joined together to be able to carry in that Mavui. They never joined together with the people in the other Chatzers to make a Shitufei Mivos. At least that's how I'm understanding it. I'm understanding it as a Shitufei Mivos. Right? Meaning, because the whole point why you wouldn't be able to carry in a Chatzer, in the Mavui, is because you have lots of different Chatzers that open up into that Mavui, and therefore it's considered like Rishus HaRabim. And if you have one Chatzer that's going to be using the Mavui, but didn't join together with all the other Chatzers to make that Mavui kind of like one Rishus to be able to carry in there, well then, you basically have this Mavui, which is usable by all these different chatzers, yet they didn't all join together, so you can't carry in there. So when Rav says that you're not allowed to carry in this Mavui that opens up into this chatzer at the end, that's because all the chatzeros didn't join together to make an Eruv to be able to carry in the Mavui, right? And therefore, that's why you're not allowed to carry in the Mavui. However, if they would have made an Eruv, well then Rav would have no problem carrying in the Mavui, even though you could walk straight through the Mavui, through the Chatzer, and get to the other side of Rishus HaRabim. And he doesn't consider that to be a Mavui Mefulash. So what do we see? We see that Rav also holds that theoretically, if you have a setup where there is a Mavui that opens up into a back area, that then opens up on the other side to Rishus HaRabim, he'll consider that a Mavui Sasum as well. And all you need to do is put up a lechi. His only concern is that if you have a chatzer in the back, and they didn't join together with all the other chatzeros to make an eruv, well then you wouldn't be able to carry in the mavui anymore. But as long as they made an eruv, you can carry in this mavui. And it's not considered a mavui mefulash. And therefore, bringing it back to the original case of Rav Yehuda, when you have a mavui that opens up into a rechava, which isn't a chatzer, and there's no need to have to do any kind of eruv, well then, he won't consider that to be a mavui mefulash, because that's not his issue. He doesn't consider, if it was a chatzer also, he wouldn't consider it to be a mavui mefulash. This isn't a mavui mefulash. The only issue by the chatzer is that when they don't make an eruv, you can't carry in the mavui because there's no eruv. As long as there's an eruv, you can carry in that mavui. We're not worried about mavui mefulash. Here also, when it comes to the back lot, well, there's no issue of mavui mefulash, and you don't need to make an eruv either. So, Rav can also be the teacher, meaning when Rav Yehuda is saying that you can carry in this mavui, even when there's a back lot, that could even be according to Rav, because Rav would say that it's a mavui sasum, and there's no need for an eruv because it's just a back lot, and you can carry in the mavui. So originally Abai wanted to say that it would have to be like Shmuel, but we can prove that, you can even say that Rav would say that, right, Kanshe ervu b'nei chatzer and b'nei mavui, kanshe lo ervu. As long as the people in that chatzer made an eruv with the people in that mavui, well then you would be allowed to carry in the mavui. Well, friends, that was Daf 7 of Masechta Ayruvin. let us do a review. So we started off about the question of how could the people in Narda have done like the chumras of Rav and the chumras of Shmuel. I thought you either choose one side and you take them chumras and kulas, not the chumras of this one and the chumras of that. So Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak said, look, they actually weren't doing like the chumras of Rav and the chumras of Shmuel. They were just doing like Rav's opinion. That Rav said that in this Mavui Akum, it would be considered a Mavui Mefulash. And also, when Rav says that the halach is like the Tanakama, that by Mavui Mefulash all you need is a Tzuras HaPesach, that's Me'ikar Adin. But if you came to ask us, we would really tell you to do like Beis Hillel, that you should put up a door. And therefore, Rav really would instruct to do exactly like the people of Narda did. Treat it as a Mavui Mefulash, and also put up a door on one end and a lechi and kor on the other, or a kor on the other. Rav Shezvi, however, says that no, you don't have to say that Rav's opinion is that you would have to put up a door. You can even say Rav's opinion is that you would put up a Tzuras HaPesach. However, it's no problem to do like the chumras of Rav and the chumras of Shmuel in this case, because you're not doing anything inherently contradictory by doing like the chumra of Rav and the chumra of Shmuel. An example of doing something contradictory would be like an example that the Gemara brought of Rabbi Akiva, when we had a havmina to say that he took Meiser Ani because he was saying that it was year 3, but then he took Meiser Sheni because he was assuming that it was year 2. Well, either it's year 2 or year 3. Don't do like the chumras when they're self-contradictory. In the end, we answered that kasha on Rabbi Akiva. But in this case, you can do like the chumra of Rav and the chumra of Shmuel without doing anything inherently contradictory, so that would be acceptable. Then we talked about this Mavui that opens up into this back lot, which then opens up into Rishus HaRabim. Rav Yehuda said that you can carry in the Mavui. The question is, was Rav Yehuda saying this statement in the name of Rav or not? So initially Abaye wanted to say that he cannot possibly be saying it in the name of Rav, because Rav says that in the case of a Mavui that opens up into a Chotzer, which then opens up into Rishus HaRabim, you would not be allowed to carry in the Mavui. And we're assuming that that's because he holds that this setup would be considered that when you have a Mavui that opens up into another area, that opens up into Rishus HaRabim, that's considered a Mavui Mefulash, and therefore you wouldn't be able to carry in the Mavui with simply a Lechi. Whereas, when you have this Mavui that opens up into this back lot, which opens up into Rishus HaRabim, Rav Yehuda seems to say that you can carry in that Mavui as long as there's a Lechi or a Korah, so therefore it can't be like Rav. In the end we said, like actually you could say like Rav Sheshes says, which is that as long as you make an Eruv in that Chatzer, you would be allowed to carry in the Mavui, which means that Rav does not consider this setup to inherently be a Mavui Mefulash, and therefore, when it comes to the original case of the Mavui that opens up into a back lot, which opens up into Rishus HaRabim, he would say, look, there's no need to make an Eruv because it's not a Chatzer, and it's not a Mavui Mefulash either. You can carry in the Mavui, so it could be like Rav as well, according to that. Friends, that was Daf Zayin. I hope you all had a great time with it, and peace out.